The European continent was inhabited by many different peoples throughout human history. The first tribe dates back to prehistoric times. The fusion of tribes from different European regions gave rise to many peoples who shared genetic ties, language, and culture, with many religious and social similarities. These tribes had different names, but the ancient Greco-Roman authors called them the Celts. The origins of the Celts goes back to the last Ice Age, with origins in the hunter-gatherer tribes that spread across Europe after the melting of the ice sheet. Among the best-known peoples who share the Celtic culture are the Gauls, Bretons, Belgians, and the ancient Irish. The Bretons were the Celtic tribes who migrated to Great Britain, where England and Scotland are today. The Gauls and the Belgians were the Celtic peoples who lived in the region of Gaul, where today is France, Belgium, and part of Italy. The Celtic culture began to develop around 800 BC with the establishment of trade routes between the tribes and other European peoples. For example, the Greeks, who referred to the Celts as Keltoi, maintained a continually active trade. The Celtic trade lines were incredibly extensive, and Chinese silk fabrics have been found in ancient graves of Celtic nobles. During the Iron Age, the Celts expanded their territories. In 400 BC, they invaded southern Europe, where Switzerland is located today. In 390 BC, they invaded the Italian peninsula and sacked Rome. This left a mark on Roman history and pride, from which that moment on had a great aversion for the people they called barbarians. At the time when Rome began its campaigns to conquer new territories, there were about 44 Celtic tribes scattered throughout Europe. Each had its own particularities in the way they lived and fought. The Celts developed an alphabet known as Ogham, the tree alphabet. The origin of the alphabet is uncertain, and it may have originated from Britain. Julius Caesar commented that the Celts from the tribe of the Helvetians also used the Greek alphabet. Given that this type of writing was uncertain and had variations, not all Celtic peoples used it in the same way, creating some confusion in the historical records. The foundation of Celtic society was agriculture. They grew wheat, barley, beans, and peas, and raised herds of goats, sheep, and cattle. They also made trade possible. Rome, for example, imported grain from various Celtic tribes to support its luxurious city. The artistic style developed by the Celts is remarkably rich and complex, with influences from various peoples, such as the Greeks and Etruscans, but always maintaining its own characteristics. Using geometric designs and spiral figures, the Celts created beautiful images of animals and sacred objects. This type of art is known as Celtic knot, which would later influence the art of the medieval period. The Celts were very skilled at handcrafting metals, including bronze, silver, and gold. They made drinking utensils, decorative pieces, and jewelry of many different kinds. A highly prized ornament of the Celts was torques, a kind of necklace usually worn by men. The most valuable ones were made entirely of gold. The Celts had a proud warrior culture, where they always tried to extol courage and virtue in battle. With this in mind, they produced weapons and pieces of armor that served as war trophies or decorative objects. Many objects have been found in archaeological excavations, among them bronze shields adorned with semi-precious stones, bronze helmets adorned with animal figures, and even highly detailed gold helmets. Many tribal chiefs used horns, horsehair, and bird feathers to adorn their helmets, which gave them a distinctive and threatening look. Women in Celtic society had a special prominence, enjoying an independence uncommon among the peoples of the time. They were entitled to their own land, cattle, and personal wealth. In most cases, they can also choose whom to marry. And if the marriage was not good for the woman, she had the right to divorce them without being judged by others. Some women also learned to fight if they so wished. This was important for their own protection and the defense of their home and children, especially when the men spent a lot of time devoted to hunting or war. It was not uncommon for women to participate directly in war, especially when their entire clan or village was in danger. The most famous of these Celtic warriors was a woman named Boudica from the Iceni tribe inhabiting Britain. After the death of her husband in a battle against the Romans, Boudica and her daughters were imprisoned and humiliated by the Romans. Boudica swore revenge, and, gathering other Celtic tribes, she ravaged 2 Roman colonies, killing all the citizens. One of these colonies was Londinium, where London is today. The Celts used to dye their hair white. Before battle, they also made blue paintings and tattoos on their bodies. These paintings could represent animals or holy spirits. It was a way for them to summon strength and courage at the moment of battle. The Celts also used chariots in battle. Usually one warrior would drive the vehicle and the other would throw darts. Chariots were so highly prized that many nobles were buried along with the wheels or even the full vehicle. Some warriors fought totally naked, battling with great fury and terrorizing the enemy, proving that they needed no protection to fight. About the appearance of Celtic warriors, the Roman historian Diodorus wrote, "Their appearance is terrifying. They are tall, with strong muscles under a white skin. They have blonde hair, but it is not a natural blonde. They bleach their hair and comb it back. They look like wooden demons, with their thick, unkempt hair like a horse's mane." But despite their ruthless and cruel reputation, the Celts also treasured music, poetry, and philosophy. The oldest city in France is called Marseille, and during the Iron Age, it was inhabited by a Greek colony. Many Celts visited Marseille to learn philosophy, to learn and to read and write with the Greeks. In their religion, the Celts believed in many gods and spiritual beings. Most of these were associated with the forces of nature and governed the cycle of life. As with most religions, the Celts also had religious leaders and representatives. These were known as Druids. The mysterious Druids formed a priestly caste. Their exact function in Celtic society is still debated by scholars. Some historians consider that they had the role of spiritual advisors and not exactly cult leaders. Their main symbol was the oak tree, which explains the meaning of the word druid, meaning oak root, which refers to a type of ancient knowledge rooted in the soil. The oak was an especially important tree in Celtic religion, and the Druids performed various rituals around or near these trees, as well as collecting the branches of mistletoe to make potions, using small bronze or iron sickles. Druids seem to have been an independent group in Celtic society, not belonging to any specific kingdom or tribe. Still, they were above any king or tribal leader. If a group of Druids voted against a king's decision, he was forced to accept the decision of the priests. Druids dressed in white or light gray. Apparently, they lived away from towns and cities, preferring to live in small groups or even alone in the forest. Although the image of Druids is associated with old men with long beards, there were also female Druids known as Druids. There is evidence that Druids made sacrifices of animals and humans. The Roman general Julius Caesar describes a macabre ritual known as the Wickerman. In this ritual, a large effigy in the shape of a man was built. Inside it, men and women accused of crimes or prisoners of war were incarcerated. In some cases, even innocent people were imprisoned. The effigy was set on fire, and the poor prisoners were burned alive in honor of the god Tyrannus. Although Julius Caesar wrote about this, no archaeological traces of this ritual have been found. It is still an inconclusive account. But then again, Julius Caesar was never known for being a liar or making up stories. The Druids were an important figure in the Celt resistance against Rome. Later, they also resisted the imposition of Christianity in Europe. For this reason, the Druids were considered a serious threat. They were persecuted and executed until they disappeared completely. The Celts did not build temples, but they built many stone circles. Some of them had huge stones with Ogham inscriptions on them. These stone circles were not exactly religious sites, but were commonly used as star observatories. The famous Stonehenge in the county of Wiltshire is not of Celtic origin, dating from the early Bronze Age. However, it may have been a base model for the Celts to create their stone circles. It is also known that the Druids had meetings and rituals at Stonehenge. Unfortunately, much of the Celtic culture has been lost over time. Their songs, poems, and religious practices reached us highly fragmented. But the most troubled period of the Celtic people is well recorded in history, the period when the Celts fought against Rome. The Celts were an ancient warrior people who considered warfare to be an essential activity in their lives. Many tribes had feuds and disputes among themselves. Often, there were bloody battles to decide who was right or wrong. Some of these conflicts had such ancient origins that tribes often warred over things that had happened many years ago. These combative and impetuous traits of the Celts were their greatest strength, but, unfortunately for them, it was also their greatest weakness. The Celts did not usually make written records about their own history. Much of what we know about them comes from Greek and Roman accounts. One of the main accounts comes from the famous Roman general Julius Caesar. He, around 50 BC, compiled his military experiences in a diary after 7 campaigns in Gaul. The diary written by Caesar was titled Commentarii de Bello Gallico, which can be translated as Commentaries on the Gallic War, and was written in Latin. Julius Caesar wanted to annex the territories of Gaul, bringing them under Roman rule. By doing so, he would raise his own social status in Rome. However, Gaul was a huge and wild territory, without roads or bridges, full of hostile Celtic tribes. Many Romans knew it as Gallia Comata, or long-haired Gaul. Among the main tribes were the Boii, Aedui, Helvetians, Arverni, Belgians, and many others. It was a network of several tribes, composed of brutal warriors. The Romans were always quite attentive to the military and political weaknesses of other peoples. Caesar was able to take advantage of this instability among the tribes and began his campaign by allying himself with the Aedui tribe. The Aedui lived in the Burgundy region of present-day France and felt threatened by the Helvetian and Arverni tribes. The Helvetians, along with the tribe of the Boii and Tuileries, had begun a large migration, leaving Switzerland and attacking villages that belonged to the Aedui. When Caesar made his legions available to help the Helvetians, the leaders of the Aedui, named Morrigan, was very pleased and accepted Roman help without much difficulty. The battle that followed became known as the Battle of Bibracte. Even though the Romans were outnumbered, their tactical superiority and disciplined formations were able to repel the Celts, who attacked with a merciless fury. Eventually, the Roman army, which was on higher ground, was able to overpower the Celts. With their cavalry surrounding the battle, they managed to attack the rear of the Celts, where the supplies were, forcing them to surrender. After the battle, many Celts were spared and freed, on the condition that they return to their lands near the Rhine River, where they were to defend the borders against invaders from the Germanic tribes. Sometime later, Caesar and his legions helped repel the Germans. In this way, the Romans got what they wanted, a clear path into Gaul territory. Morrigan, the king of the Aedui, added 3,000 Celtic horsemen to the Roman army, increasing the strength and confidence of Julius Caesar's legions. Many battles were fought over the next 6 years. Some tribes followed the example of the Aedui, allying themselves with the Roman army. These tribes were always seduced with promises of riches and trade with Rome. At the same time, they took the opportunity to finish off enemy tribes and settle old blood feuds. Despite their courage in battle, the Celts had no disciplined armies. Their warriors fought individually, relying on strength, agility, and savagery to attack Roman formations. As this approach seemed unsuccessful, they began to use guerrilla tactics, attacking the legions by surprise, during the march or at night. Still, Rome's advance was relentless. The kings of the remaining tribes needed some time to realize what was happening. Roman promises quickly turned into threats. The Celts were caught in a spiderweb by their own ambitions. Around 53 BC, the Celtic Belgians of the Eburonian tribe revolted against the demands of Rome, which needed to feed its legions, and for that, it wanted the Eburonian crops. The king of the Eburones was called Ambiorix. He incited his warriors to take up arms against their oppressors, forming the so-called Ambiorix Revolt. To contain this revolt, Caesar sent the commanders Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta, commanding the 14th Twin Legion and also a detachment of 5 cohorts, totaling approximately 7,500 men. But to the surprise of the Romans, the Celtic Belgians had recruited a staggering number of warriors. It is not known for sure how many there were, but it is estimated that there were 4 Celts for every Roman soldier, or even more. The The Romans were attacked by surprise during their march in a region known as Atuatuca. Ambiorix's forces came from two different directions. The result was a massacre. Almost all the Roman soldiers were killed, including two commanders sent by Caesar. This event was known as the Massacre at Atuatuca. The survivors reported the terror they witnessed, and Julius Caesar wrote in his diary, "Of all the Gauls, the Belgians are the bravest." The revolt came to an end when Caesar and his 50,000 soldiers entered the scene. Virtually all the Celtic Belgian tribes were massacred, and their villages and crops were looted and burned. Ambiorix and some of his men managed to cross the Rhine River and escape towards Germania, but were never seen again. Ambiorix's revolt aroused a kind of nationalistic feeling among the Celts. Many tribes began to put their differences aside to unite against Roman oppression. Much of this new resistance was organized by the Druids. The union of the tribes in Gaul had always been something feared by the Romans, but it was finally happening. A young prince took on the responsibility of fighting for the freedom of his people. Vercingetorix was a prince of the son of Celtillus, the king of the Averni. His name means the chief of the great warriors. The Averni were one of the richest and most developed Celtic tribes. Much of this wealth came from their alliance with Rome. Vercingetorix himself served in Caesar's army, where he learned to speak Latin and learned Roman battle tactics. After his father's death, Vercingetorix was expelled from his hometown in a political conspiracy that prevented him from ascending to the throne. Even so, he decided to recruit all of those who agreed to fight for him, whether they were farmers, thieves, or vagabonds. Vercingetorix, already with some fame, returned to his former city and regained the right to the throne. With his status restored, he began to send emissaries to the chiefs of other tribes, asking for help in fighting Rome. After establishing some alliances, Vercingetorix and his commanders began to train the Celts according to Roman discipline, creating an army as never before seen among the Celtic peoples. Vercingetorix knew that his greatest advantage against the legions was a large and organized cavalry. When Julius Caesar learned of the formation of this army, he organized a military expedition to fight the Celtic rebels. The Romans went all over Gaul, demanding loyalty from various Celtic leaders. This demand was based on more promises and threats. Thus, many tribal chiefs did not support Vercingetorix. Battles were fought, mainly between Roman and Celtic cavalries, with the former almost always winning. Vercingetorix was forced to retreat. But in his escape through Gaulish territory, he decided to use scorched earth tactics, a strategy of burning villages, towns, and farms, not allowing the enemy army to seize anything. After losing the city of Bourges, Vercingetorix was forced to flee with what was left of his troops. With his army already greatly reduced, Vercingetorix continued to send emissaries, asking for military support from Celtic chieftains, even those who had already sworn allegiance to Rome. Finally, Vercingetorix was forced to take refuge in the city of Alesia, a great defensive point, since it was built on a hill. What followed was one of the saddest and most shameful chapters in Celtic history. In September 52 BC, Alesia was besieged by Julius Caesar. The Romans built two wooden walls around the city, one to keep Vercingetorix and his men imprisoned, the other to repel the Celtic army, which was approaching to rescue the citizens of Alesia. The siege itself was relatively normal. The Romans cut off water and food supplies in the city, forcing the inhabitants to starve and thirst. Even as many did, the brave Celts refused to surrender, waiting to be saved by an army of their countrymen. This army did emerge, but was unable to defeat or push the Romans back, who had already established a strong defensive position. After this defeat, the morale of those inside the city was destroyed. Realizing that there would be no further rescue attempts, they were overcome by despair. Other Celtic leaders refused to send troops to help Vercingetorix, fearing the revenge of the Romans. With no other way out, and trying to save the rest of the survivors of Alesia, Vercingetorix surrendered. Vercingetorix's surrender was an iconic moment, being depicted in many classical paintings. According to the French historian Augustin Thierry, Vercingetorix rode proudly to the Roman camp, stopped in front of the powerful Roman general without saying a word, and threw his weapons disdainfully at Caesar's feet. Vercingetorix's courage and dedication in fighting for his people eventually cost him dearly. He was stripped, imprisoned, transported to Rome, and incarcerated in a small cell, where he lived in humiliation for 6 years. After 6 long years, Vercingetorix was taken from his cell and forced to walk through the streets of Rome tied to Julius Caesar's carriage in a ceremony known as the Triumph, whose purpose was to extol the achievements of Roman generals in foreign campaigns. After the ceremony, Vercingetorix was taken back to his cell, where he was strangled by Roman soldiers on orders from Julius Caesar. At the site of the former city of Alesia, there is a statue in honor of Vercingetorix and the resistance of the Celtic people. The Celtics' fight against Rome was more than just a few battles for territories. It was a fight for freedom. Vercingetorix's surrender marked the end of the Celts' resistance against Rome. But the Celts and their culture endured. Many learned to live and prosper under Rome. The fame of Celtic warriors spread throughout Europe and beyond. Many warriors were mercenaries in Greece, Egypt, Anatolia, and the Roman army itself. With the arrival of Christianity, Celtic culture gradually dissolved. On the one hand, this happened due to the assimilation of the new religion, but the Celtic culture was also being assimilated. However, the courage and perseverance of the Celtic peoples will forever be recorded in history.
Dagda is one of Ireland's most famous mythological gods. He is known as the Good God for his generosity, but he was also a merciless warrior and terrific fighter. He led the sons of the goddess Danu, known as the Tuatha De Danann, to conquer Ireland. He was a stocky god, and possessed as a weapon his mighty club. He had the power on one side of the weapon to bring death, but on the other side he could revive people. He also owned a large cauldron that appeared bottomless, by means of which Dagda could nourish an infinite number of people, while the next day the cauldron would be full again. His most famous love affair was with Morrigan the War Goddess. He won the goddess's sympathy in the war against the Firbolgs, leading Danu's sons to victory. Dagda ruled over Ireland for 80 years and was a god associated with fertility, wealth, virility, and strength. Morrigan is an Irish goddess whose name means Ghost Queen or Queen of Death. This major Celtic deity is primarily associated with death, fate, war, and destruction. However, she is also associated with sexuality and fertility. She is part of a triad of goddesses, which includes Bad and Magh, both of whom carry aspects of Morrigan herself. The goddess would present herself in different forms during the battles in which she took part. Generally, she took the shape of a raven and drank the blood of the corpses on the battlefield. Occasionally, however, the goddess would transform into a wolf and an eel. Morrigan had an important role in some stories in Celtic mythology. During the Battle of Moytura, fought between the Tuatha De Danann and the Firbolgs, 2 races that inhabited Ireland, she came to the king of the Tuatha, named Nuada. She had intercourse with him, and the next day, in the form of a raven, she echoed in the king's mind words of encouragement and inspiration for the fight he was soon to face. Upon uttering such words, she guided the god to the battlefield. In the Second Battle of Moytura, a clash between the race of the Tuatha and the Fomorians, the goddess played an interesting role as well. At one point, Morrigan was seen by Dagda, the god of knowledge, on the bank of a river, washing armor and bloody clothes. Dagda then walked up to her. They spoke to each other, and after the conversation, they had intercourse. This encounter was highly stimulating for Dagda, who, after it, felt poised and motivated for the fight that was to come. In the Second Battle of Moytura, the goddess also made an appearance to the mighty Lugh, giving him words of encouragement and inspiration to face the upcoming war. Morrigan also had an important role in the path of Cuchulainn, one of the Celtic mythology's most important heroes. She stood before him in some battles, assuming different forms. For instance, on one occasion she appeared as a very attractive woman and tried to seduce him but was rejected. She could not bear to be snubbed and wanted revenge. She took an active part in the events that led to the death of the legendary Irish hero. Cernunnos is also known as the Cornish god. He was one of the Celts' most important deities and one of Europe's oldest gods. His physical depiction displays him with a blending of some human aspects and animal traits. He looks humanoid but possesses a pair of horns and is usually depicted seated, cross-legged and wearing a torque, a kind of choker on his neck, hand, or both, a symbol of nobility. Cernunnos is a deity connected to the forests, the woods, the domestic and wild animals, and also the plants. He is the lord of nature and is primarily associated with abundance, fertility, prosperity, and life. Lugh is one of the most famous characters in Irish Celtic mythology. On the paternal side, he descended from the Tuatha De Danann, deities of goodness and light. On the maternal side, he descended from the monstrous Fomorians. His mother was the daughter of Balor, the one with the terrible eye. As a child, Lugh escaped being killed by Balor. A prophecy said that the one-eyed giant would be murdered by his grandson. So he ordered the death of his grandchild, but to no avail. Lugh went on to become an incredible blacksmith as an adult. He became a deity linked to craftsmen, blessing those who make a living from manual labor. The god became the owner of two of the most precious treasures of the Tuatha De Danann, Lugh's glorious spear and the light sword of King Nuada, also of the Tuatha De Danann. With these artifacts, he fought the Fomorians' monstrous forces in epic battles. After King Nuada's death before the mighty Balor, Lugh led the Tuatha De Danann towards victory against the Fomorians. With his powerful sling, Lugh pierced Balor's evil eye, killing this monstrous being. The prophecy was fulfilled, and the island of Ireland was saved. Lugh's victory symbolizes the victory of light over darkness. Even the term Lugh means light or luminosity. Lugh became a solar deity, warrior, blacksmith, medicine, patron of the Druidic arts, and of many other elements. His importance extends far beyond the Irish borders, being represented in the pantheons of almost all European Celtic peoples. His son is Cú Chulainn, the most famous hero of Irish mythology. This further enhanced his father's glory and legacy. Brigit is a goddess of Irish mythology. She is a kindly figure, associated with wisdom, healing, blacksmiths, and poetry. She is the daughter of Dagda and Morrigan, making her a deity of the Tuatha De Danann lineage. Brigid marries Bress, who reigned over the Tuatha De Danann even though he had the blood of the Fomorian enemies in his veins. This marriage was required to seal the peace between the peoples. With him, the goddess had 3 sons, Brian, Euchre, and Ur. Brigid is a triple goddess, taking the forms of poet goddess, medicine goddess, and fiery goddess. She is the fire that warms the forges, that heats the alchemical experiments, and generates the spark that ignites the poet's inspiration. The cult of the goddess spread throughout the pan-Celtic world. One of the most famous influences is the British goddess Brigante. Due to syncretism, this cult encompassed Celtic and Roman elements, and as a result, the goddess was also strongly associated with Minerva, the Roman wisdom deity. Eventually, the goddess came to relate to the 5th century Christian saint Brigida of Kildare, who would become Ireland's patron saint. February 1st, a day marked by celebrations in honor of the Irish goddess, became St. Brigid's Day. This date has many traces of ancient pagan traditions. Nuada is a divine hero of Irish Celtic mythology. He is the leader of the Tuatha De Danann, a group of gods and goddesses who ruled Ireland in the early days of that land. Nuada is known as a warrior god and portrayed as a brave and courageous fighter. In Irish mythology, Nuada was a born leader and skilled strategist. He was also known to be just, always fighting for truth and justice. One of the most famous stories about Nuada is his participation in leading the Tuatha De Danann during the Battle of Mythora against the Firbolgs. During this war, Nuada was severely wounded and lost his arm. Being crippled, he was forced to resign as leader and king of the Tuatha De Danann. With the help of the gods, Nuada received a beautiful silver arm to replace the lost limb. Thus, he could once again become leader of his people. Nuada was killed in a battle against Balor, a tyrannical god known as the Terrible Eye. Balor was one of the leaders of the Fomorians, a group of malevolent gods who invaded Ireland and fought against the Tuatha De Danann. Balor killed Nuada with a powerful bolt of lightning, fired from his terrible eye, which was capable of destroying everything around him. Nuada was succeeded by Lugh, the god of light, as leader of the Tuatha De Danann. He was responsible for exterminating Balor and restoring peace to Ireland. The legendary King Nuada had his image forever associated with the struggle for freedom and independence. He became a symbol of pride and connection to Ireland's cultural roots. Boudica was a warrior queen of ancient Britain. During the Iron Age and the early years of Roman rule, she was the leader of the Iceni, a Celtic tribe that inhabited the region of East Anglia in today's southeast Britain. Boudica rose to fame for her rebellion against Roman rule around 60 and 61 AD, a feat that inspired other peoples to fight against the dominance of the mighty Roman Empire. Not much is known about Boudica's childhood, but as she was a woman of Iceni nobility, she's probably received some form of education. The Celtic tribes highly esteemed poetry, music, and history, and these oral traditions were an important part of their culture. Not surprisingly, members of the Celtic nobility, regardless of gender, were trained in the arts of war. Given Boudica's ferocious and fearless approach to her later leadership, she may have had some military training, or at least been familiar with the warrior traditions of her people. By the time Boudica was of age, her family sought an arranged marriage with a young man of noble lineages called Prasutagus, who was the heir to the throne of the Iceni tribe. They ruled a region of Britain that corresponds to modern-day East Anglia. The couple had 2 daughters, whose names have unfortunately not been registered in the historical sources that have survived to the present day. Prasutagus's dealings with the Roman Empire were complex. While the Iceni were an autonomous tribe, they enjoyed a friendly alliance with Rome, allowing them a certain amount of autonomy in their internal affairs. As Rome's ally, Prasutagus appointed the Roman Emperor Nero as joint heir to his kingdom and its wealth, along with his 2 daughters, to protect his people from growing Roman ambition. Nevertheless, the Romans decided to annex the whole of East Anglia after Prasutagus's death, disregarding the inheritance rights of his daughters. They invaded the Iceni lands and used their military might to sack the villages and take slaves wherever they went. Trying to stop this injustice, Boudica and her daughters sought an audience with the Romans, but they had no idea that the worst was yet to come. The Romans generally had no appreciation or respect for people they considered to be barbarians, and this included the Iceni and other Celtic tribes. Boudica, a woman from a tribe of barbarians, demanded change and the withdrawal of Roman troops from their territories, and this was probably a great insult to the Roman procurator Catus Decianus. Boudica was arrested and flogged while her daughters were raped by the Roman soldiers. Although humiliated, Boudica was still a queen of a warrior people, and her anger would not be quenched. Enraged and determined to avenge her family's honor and the wrong done to her people, Boudica swore revenge on Rome. She gathered her tribe and summoned the leaders of the other allied Celtic tribes. In an impassioned speech, Boudica exalted the courage and warrior traditions of her people, remembered how their ancestors managed to drive out the Romans when Julius Caesar attempted to take their land, and insisted that ancient oaths of alliance be honored. As the crowd listened to her speech, they acclaimed Boudica as the liberator who would lead them in the fight against Rome. and soon the news spread to other Celtic tribes further afield. The uprising started with the assault on the city of Camulodunum, an ancient tribal capital that had been transformed into a Roman colony. Boudica and her forces sacked and destroyed the city. The city of Londinium, a thriving Roman commercial hub at the time, was the next target. Anticipating the threat, the Roman governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinius opted to vacate the city rather than defend it. Boudica then entered, sacked, and burned Londinium. Much like the fate of Londinium and Camulodunum, the city of Verulamium was also raided and destroyed by Boudica's rebel army. Estimates suggest that the rebels killed between 70,000 and 80,000 people in the three cities, based on the accounts of Roman historians. Following this catastrophe, the Roman procurator Catus Decianus, who had caused the rebellion, fled to Gaul in fear of Boudica's relentless fury. To formalize her victories, Boudica celebrated festivals in honor of the war goddess Andraste, to whom Roman prisoners were offered as sacrifices. Although Boudica's army was vast, numbering over 200,000 rebels, they lacked the discipline, training, and cutting-edge tactics of the Romans. In contrast, the Roman troops under the command of Gaius Suetonius Paullinus were numerically inferior, with around only 10,000 men, but they were well-trained and experienced. Suetonius picked a battlefield that was set in narrow terrain flanked by dense forests, preventing Boudica's army from using its greater numbers to encircle and outnumber the Romans. This strategic choice restricted the power of Boudica's figures. As the battle started, the Roman infantry kept a solid line, pushing against the rebels with spears and shields, making coordinated advances. Boudica's army, notwithstanding their fierce determination, proved unable to break through or bypass this formation. They were eventually pushed back, and blocked in their escape routes by their own war chariots and the terrain, many were massacred. The battle ended in a crushing victory for the Romans. Roman historians such as Tacitus claimed that almost 80,000 Britons were killed, while Roman losses were only around 400 legionaries. Following the defeat, Boudica is thought to have committed suicide to avoid being captured by the Romans. The precise method of her suicide is unknown, with some sources suggesting that she took poison. Although Boudica's revolt was suppressed, it had a lasting impact on Roman and British memory. The Romans reinforced their military presence in Britain and took measures to settle territorial disputes and prevent further revolts. In turn, Boudica is remembered as a heroine of resistance against oppression and as a symbol of the strength and bravery of the British people.
The mysterious Druids were pivotal figures in the Celtic tribes of Gaul, Britannia, and Ireland. However, with the fall of the Roman Empire, unfortunately, much of what was written about them in ancient times was lost. Some describe the Druids as philosophers, others as magicians or priests. They lived among the Celtic tribes, and quite possibly, their name meant wise men of the oak. They taught a secret wisdom, often connected to trees, with their sacred sites being woodlands in the forests. The Druids' exact roots are uncertain. In his account of the Roman conquest of Gaul, Julius Caesar implied that the Druids' teachings originally came from Britannia, while a Greek scholar asserted that they acquired their knowledge from the Greek philosopher Pythagoras. The Druids were split into three main categories: bards, ovates, and druids. The bards were poets, the ovates were soothsayers, and the druids were teachers. This system reflected a society where the oral passing on of knowledge was sacred, and writing down Druid teachings was forbidden. During their training, Druids memorized extensive amounts of knowledge in verse form, a task that could take up to 20 years, encompassing areas such as theology, astronomy, and divination. Upon completion of their studies, the Druids formed a privileged class, tax-free and exempt from military service, and oversaw settling disputes. With regard to their ceremonies, the sources are scant and often unreliable. For instance, the Roman author Pliny described the Druids harvesting mistletoe from oak trees with a golden sickle. scattered references can be found of Druids partaking in animal or human sacrifices to the gods, but specific details are sparse. The 3rd and 4th century references imply that the Druids continued to live on the Roman conquest, but with a diminished social status. For instance, a 3rd century Druidess worked as an innkeeper. Latin texts from the 1st centuries of the Middle Ages, mostly biographies of saints from the era of Christian conversions, do mention the Druids, but without offering any new information. The oak, a long-lasting and majestic tree, held a special significance in Druidism, reflecting the Druids' awe for nature, and their belief that all forms of life were interconnected. This symbolism implies that the oak was seen as a portal to higher knowledge and the spiritual world, reinforcing the idea that the Druids were the sages of the oak. The Druids believed that every tree contained a spirit, and that some trees, such as the oak, contained special powers. The oak was worshipped for its strength, longevity, and its association with lightning, as it is often struck by lightning. This contributed to the belief that the oak was a bridge between heaven and earth, uniting the physical and spiritual realms. Additionally, the oak was known for its ability to survive and thrive for centuries, representing endurance, stability, and wisdom. Among the best-known rituals surrounding the oak tree was the gathering of the mistletoe, a plant that grew on its branches. The Roman author Pliny depicted the Druids using a golden sickle to collect mistletoe from an oak tree, a ritual that probably had deep significance for life, death, and renewal. Growing between heaven and earth on the sacred tree, mistletoe was seen as a powerful symbol of life and fertility. This reverence was not confined to worship. The Druids researched the properties of trees for medicinal and spiritual purposes, integrating this knowledge into their healing practices and rituals. The Druidic tree cult also placed emphasis on conservation and ecological balance. They understood that the ecosystem's health was essential for the well-being of all living beings, and protecting forests and preserving biodiversity was essential. This ancient wisdom still rings true today, in an era of growing environmental sustainability awareness. Sacred woodlands, where many Druidic rituals took place, were seen as places of great power and wisdom. They were areas where the physical and spiritual worlds interacted, and where the Druids looked for guidance, healing, and knowledge. The Druids held ceremonies in these sacred places to celebrate the changing of the seasons, weddings, and other rites of passage, and divination and meditation practices. The Druid Wheel of Life ritual was a key element in Celtic culture. This cosmogrammatic wheel is split into 8 festivals, marking seasonal changes and major astronomical events, each with its own set of symbolisms and associated deities. These included Samhain, the start of the Celtic year, and the period of deepest darkness; Imbolc, the start of spring; Beltane, a fertility festival; Lughnasadh, a harvest festival; and the solstices and equinoxes, each depicting a crucial point in the relationship between sunlight and the earth. These festivals were not just observations of nature, but also moments when the community could come together, celebrate, and reflect on the seasonal changes and their deeper meanings. Besides the Wheel of Life, the Ogham alphabet, known as the alphabet of the trees, is another key symbolic element in Druidism. Native to ancient Ireland, the Ogham is made up of 20 basic letters called fuse, each representing a specific tree or plant. The Ogham was traditionally engraved in stone or wood, with inscriptions being read from bottom to top in vertical lines. Each Ogham letter is connected to a unique symbolism, including a specific tree, a color, an agricultural tool, and an art. The letter B, for instance, would be associated with the birch tree, signifying new beginnings and rebirth. Ogham practice was rooted in the belief that each tree possessed a unique spirit or energy, and by connecting with these spirits, Druids could gain unique insights and guidance. The Druids' connection with the natural elements of earth, air, fire, and water is another significant aspect of their rituals. Each was connected to different parts of life and the cosmos. Earth was used to symbolize stability and fertility. Air represented intellect and communication. Fire was connected to energy and transformation. and water represented emotion and intuition. These elements were summoned and honored in many Druidic rituals, establishing a balance and harmony between the human and the natural. Druids also viewed the sun and moon as important energy and wisdom sources. The cycle of the sun, signaling the different stages of the day and the seasons, as well as the cycle of the moon with its phases, were observed and celebrated in specific rituals. These cycles were considered metaphors for the cycle of life, death, and rebirth, a central Druid belief. The Druid's demise is inextricably bound up with the spread of the Roman Empire and the ensuing Christianization of Europe. Once the Romans conquered Gaul and Britannia, the Druids started to disappear from classical sources, indicating a sharp deterioration in their influence and presence in civic life. Throughout the Roman occupation, the Druids suffered significant persecution, as their beliefs and practices were seen as a threat to Roman rule and order. With their emphasis on loyalty to the emperor and the Roman gods, they saw Druidism, with its deep sense of connection to the earth and nature, as a form of resistance and rebellion. This led to the severe crackdowns on the Druids, including the banning of their cults and the razing of their sacred sites. The Roman persecution impacted the Druids and their traditions in devastating ways. Many were driven into hiding or forced to adapt to the new cultural and religious order. This marked a significant change in the Druids' role and status in society, from a privileged and respected class to a shadow of their former power and influence. The Christianization of Europe further contributed to Druidism's decline. As Christianity spread, assimilating and replacing pagan religions, many ancient Druidic rituals and practices were either lost or transformed to suit the new dominant faith. At times, Christian saints took the place of pagan figures and deities, and Christian feasts were imposed on ancient Celtic rituals, losing the Druidic oral tradition, a core aspect of their practice and teaching, was particularly detrimental. With no way passing on their knowledge and wisdom through the generations, much of what the Druids knew and did was forgotten or twisted over time. Also, with no written records of Druidic practices, much of their knowledge was inevitably lost after the persecution and conversion to Christianity. Yet, despite these setbacks, the Druid legacy did not disappear entirely. Some elements of their beliefs and practices have remained in the folk traditions, legends, and agricultural practices of Celtic communities. These bits of Druidic lore, albeit scattered and frequently piecemeal, acted as a bridge to a revival of interest in Druidism in later times. The modern revival of Druidism, representing a transition from historical Druidism to a contemporary form, started modestly in the 18th century with the ancient Druid Order, the first modern-day Druidic organization, a far cry from the imagery of Druids in white robes at mystic gatherings. The reality was more mundane. A group of men in ordinary robes in a private room of a pub, making the first tentative steps towards a Druidic revival over pints of ale and cider. Some new practitioners of Druidism tried to reform Christianity into a more ecological form, while others rejected it altogether and sought an alternative faith. This latter direction encountered serious legal problems, as the belief in more than one god and the question of the Trinity doctrine were criminal offenses under British law until the beginning of the 19th century. These Druids with alternative views had to proceed with caution. This period, however, was highlighted by some surprisingly groundbreaking religious thinking. The main theme of this new spirituality was pantheism, the belief that the universe itself is a living, divine being. This notion profoundly impacted the era, offering an alternative to both religious dogmatism and the emerging materialism. Druidism revival tried to combine the worship of nature with a deep spirituality, reimagining and reconstructing Druidic practices and beliefs in a way that would fit into the contemporary world. During the 19th century, Druidism kept evolving, influencing and being in turn influenced by other spiritual and cultural movements. The Druids engaged in environmental and social issues, seeking ways to bring their principles and beliefs into the emerging industrial society. They advocated nature conservation and examined ways of living in greater harmony with the natural world. Druidism itself witnessed the expansion of its artistic and cultural influence during this period. Many Druids got involved in art, poetry, and music, and used these forms of expression to further explore and impart their values and beliefs. Druidic festivals and gatherings turned into occasions to celebrate nature and spirituality, as well as to reflect on environmental and social issues. Druidism enjoyed an even greater resurgence in the 20th century, with a growing number of people looking for spiritual and philosophical alternatives to traditional religions and secular materialism. New Druidic orders and groups were created, each bringing their own unique interpretation and practice of Druidism. These organizations concentrated on aspects such as spiritual practice, environmental protection, education, and community, mirroring a wide range of interpretations and approaches to Druidism. The revival of Druidism is both a continuation and a reimagining of ancient traditions. While modern Druids may not look exactly like their historical counterparts, they retain the Druid spirit, a profound respect for nature, a quest for wisdom, and a dedication to community and the well-being of the planet.
The history of the island of Ireland is marked by magic and mystery. According to some myths and legends, the origin of the people dates to the descendants of Noah. The island was the destination of immigrants from the most diverse places in the world: Greeks, Iberians, and even from the Far East. These people tried to settle in the beautiful Irish lands. At first, everything seemed to go well. But taming the island's nature was no easy task. Plagues and dark creatures ravaged these populations. Some of these settlements were totally ruined. But some clans managed to overcome adversity, establishing themselves solidly in the Irish lands. Among them were the Firbolg, descendants of the legendary Nemed, the Scythian explorer who set sail from the Caspian Sea to settle in Ireland. The Nemedians were a brave and persistent people. They were challenged by monsters, rival clans, and pirates. But these disputes brought the people of Nemed even closer together. They spread across the island, and new tribes and clans were formed. Nemed's descendants prospered and divided the island between them, dominating Ireland. But their priests sensed that there was a new force coming to Ireland, capable of tipping the balance of power. Having set out from the legendary Northern Islands, the Tuatha De Danann, known as the sons of the goddess Danu, arrived in Ireland. Protected by a magical haze, the Tuatha landed safely on the verdant island. These new people were composed of strong, beautiful men and quite skilled in the arts of metallurgy. Their weapons and props were meticulously crafted and ornate. These men had the blessing of the gods and landed with divine magical artifacts. Among these treasures were the Stone of Festiny, which revealed the most diverse prophecies, the mighty Spear of Assal, the unbeatable Sword of Light, and the Dagda's Cauldron, which magically produced food capable of supplying an entire army. Their warriors were strong and fearless. They did not fear death on the battlefield, something that made them formidable fighters. These invaders carried all their possessions with them, showing that this was not an exploratory expedition or a mere plunder of those lands. The Tuatha De Danann received knowledge of the Druidic arts from the gods. Their paths were guided by wise Druids, who helped their leaders in their mission to conquer Ireland. But to achieve their goal, the children of the goddess Danu had to face a formidable enemy, the Firbolg. Nemed's descendants saw a great strange smoke in the skies, originating from the coast. The Tuatha De Danann were performing a great ritual for the gods, where they burned their ships. This year could only mean one thing: these invaders were here to stay, if only to die. The Firbolg decided to send Shreng, one of their strongest and bravest warriors, to make first contact with the invaders. They wanted to show how strong they were, in case the invaders insisted on staying in their territories. With his combat attire and the strongest weapons, Shrang set out with the goal of intimidating his enemies. Seeing that imposing figure approaching, the Tuatha sent the warrior Bress to meet him. He was one of the bravest warriors among the sons of Danu. The warriors looked at and assessed each other, but they were not there to fight, not even to negotiate. The two warriors wanted to get to know their respective opponents better, for conflict between their peoples was inevitable. Despite the tension, the conversation between Bress and Shrang was friendly. They discovered that their people had a common ancestor, and that they might even be sister peoples. Bress presented the Firbolg with the proposal sent by the chiefs of his people. It was a chance to avoid a terrible bloodbath. But, as a condition, the Firbolg were to cede half the island of Ireland to the newcomers. Shrang promised to take the proposal to his king, but anticipated that his people were made up of brave and proud warriors. Therefore, their positions were sometimes as inflexible as a great oak tree. The two warriors bid a cordial farewell. Shrang was impressed by the quality of the weapons and armor of Bress and his men. The foreigner, on the other hand, was not particularly impressed by Shrang's weapons, but he saw the steely courage in the eyes of Nemed's descendant. Bress told Nuada, king of the people of the goddess Danu, of his impressions of those people. The king wished that his proposal would be accepted by the Firbolg, and the carnage could be avoided. But when Shrang presented the proposal offered by King Nuada, angry cries were heard in the gathering. Those people were proud, and the proposal was not only outrageous, but a true insult. Shrang warned the tribal chiefs that the enemy was strong and had superior equipment. Dividing the lands with the outsiders seemed the most sensible measure, for the vast Irish lands were too large to be occupied and protected by the Firbolg. Other more aggressive peoples would arise in the future to claim the unoccupied lands. But Eochaid, the high chief of the Firbolg, with the support of the other chiefs, refused the proposal. They believed that, if they gave up half of Ireland, the sons of Danu would want the whole island for themselves. In preparations for war, the people of the goddess Danu moved their camp to a black hill, known as Sly Belgadane. There they erected their defenses, awaiting the inevitable conflict, and believing that that hill would be the point that guaranteed them the right to live in Ireland. The Druids of the Tuatha De Danann performed rituals to their gods, and these proved favorable to their endeavor. The Tuatha De's sorcery was strong. Dense clouds poured violent rains over the heads of the Firbolg alone. Lightning lit up the skies like a rain of fire. There was no peace among the sons of Nemed. There were 3 consecutive days of torment, until the mages of the Firbolg managed to disperse the magical cloud and let the sun shine again. The Firbolg army was finally assembled and ready to march against their enemies when they spotted Druids sent by the invaders. They tried one last time to avoid conflict by asking them to reconsider their decision not to divide Ireland. But once again, Eochaid, the supreme chief of the Firbolg, refused. He did not wish for peace, only to see the people of the goddess Danu away from that island. The envoys proposed an armistice, so that the two sides could prepare for combat on equal terms. After a fair fight, the winner would be revealed, showing what the will of the gods was. The Firbolg were honorable men and agreed to the armistice, even though it was unfavorable to them. As the truce ended, and before the great battle, young warriors from both sides met for a spear-throwing duel. They showed great agility, firing and dodging darts coming from various directions. The young men even seemed to enjoy themselves, until they began to tumble, fatally wounded. What looked like a youthful prank became the prelude to the bloodbath that followed. The Firbolg's superior spear-throwing skills allowed them to outclass the sons of Danu. This small victory boosted the morale of the people of Nemed, who marched confidently into the real fight. The real war between Danu's sons and the Fir Bolg people was about to begin. The day of the battle for Ireland had come. The sons of the goddess Danu awaited their enemies, while the Fir Bolg wanted to push the invaders back into the sea. The hosts of warriors were profiled and ready to fill the verdant soil chosen for battle with the blood of their enemies. Tuatha De Danann formed a rigid defensive body, trying to hold the defensive line with a wall of shields. Shoulder to shoulder with the invaders stood Dagda, the warrior god of precise and terrible blows. With this mighty god at their side, the Tuatha De Danann felt protected. But the Fir Bolg fought with the courage of those who wanted to protect their home and offspring. They attacked so fiercely that the invaders' defensive line broke, and panic spread among the warriors. Danu's sons had lost the first fight and fled to regroup in their camp, but the war was far from over. The night after the first battle caused huge euphoria among the Fir Bolg. But the next morning, while Eochaid, the high chief of the Fir Bolg, was refreshing himself on the banks of a stream, he noticed someone approaching behind him. He turned around and saw sinister figures. They were Druid assassins who wanted to kill the Fir Bolg leader to prevent an even greater bloodbath. The king was defenseless, and his weapon was out of range. The ambush seemed perfect. But the Druids did not expect the arrival of a young Fir Bolg warrior who stood between the king and the three assassins. He fought alone against the three assailants. The three Druids were killed, but the brave young man also did not resist the injuries of the heroic combat. A monument was erected in honor of the lone champion, and the hill where the fight took place became known as the Hill of Tara. The second day of fighting was as bloody as the first. Combatants on both sides perished in great numbers. Great warriors fought duels, while other warriors took part in fights so confusing that it was often difficult to distinguish between friend and foe. After a full day of fighting, both armies returned to their camps, considering themselves victors. In the camp of the sons of Danu, the god Dagda motivated his warriors and promised to lead them to victory. But they were to stand firm and not to tremble at the enemy's feet. Srang, the brave Fir Bolg warrior, led the attack of his tribe. At the head of his army, he exterminated dozens of opponents. The great Dagda dueled with Curb, a divine hero of the Fir Bolg tribe. The fury of the clash between the two great warriors impressed the other combatants. In the end, though he fought heroically, Curb perished at the feet of the great Dagda. The green Irish meadows were painted red, and crows were feasting on the corpses lying there. One could still hear the groans of the dying warriors who gave their last breaths. One of the blackbirds hovering over the battlefield did not take its eyes off Nuada, the chief of the Tuatha De Danann. The leader of Dana's children was lost in his thoughts when he felt a strange presence. Behind him stood a woman so beautiful and seductive that she could only be a goddess. She was Morrigan, a goddess associated with war and destruction. She promised him victory in his ear and gently led him to his tent. Nuada awoke in his bed after a night of intense love. He could still see Morrigan in the form of a raven, flying away from his tent. The king of the Tuatha De believed that, despite the difficulties imposed by the Fir Bolg, he would lead his people to triumph. A new day of combat began, a repeat of the previous days. Fir Bolg killed Tuatha De Danann, and Tuatha De Danann killed Fir Bolg. But a great duel was about to take place. The great Srang was ready to challenge King Nuada in combat. The king knew that victory over the Fir Bolg champion would be a terrible blow to the morale of his enemy, and so he advanced against him with terrible ferocity. The other combatants stopped to watch the duel. The tension in the air was enormous. Nuada and Srang exchanged brutal blows. Each of those could decide the fight at any moment. Shrang, filled with fury, struck a huge blow, shattering Nuada's shield. Without protection, the king was vulnerable, and his arm was severed. The king cried out for help. One of his nobles quickly helped him, placing himself between the Firbolg champion and his king. The great Dagda also rushed to Nuada's aid. The presence of the two great warriors made Shrang retreat. The king was removed from the battlefield by healing druids, and the battle continued. Bress, one of the leading warriors among the sons of Danu, wanted to avenge his king. He sought out Eochaid, the Firbolg king, on the battlefield. He tried to make his way among the enemy hosts, knocking down all who crossed his path, but eventually died before he reached the king. The Firbolg king offered great resistance to the army of the sons of Danu, who at that moment seemed to have the upper hand. Exhausted and thirsty, the king withdrew from the fight to seek water, but the wizards of the Tuatha Dé dried up all the streams near the king, who found only muddy puddles. The king was eventually surrounded by his enemies, but Eochaid, as brave as a bear harried by wolves, took the lives of several more of his enemies before he perished from numerous wounds. The Firbolg armies suffered a great defeat. However, under Shrang's leadership, they continued to resist. Night came again. Imminent death loomed over the Firbolg. There were few alternatives, and their hope for victory faded. To flee that land after so much blood had been spilled seemed dishonorable, and begging for their lives was unthinkable. The only honorable way out was to go to the battlefield again. Incredulous, the Tuatha Dé Danann saw the ragged Firbolg army again, ready for a fight. Danu's sons had already practically won the war, but a final terrible battle seemed imminent. But the Tuatha Dé Danann chiefs and druids considered that blood shouldn't be shed, and presented a peace proposal. Shrang and the few remaining Firbolg were offered a fifth of Ireland, and the promise of friendship between the two peoples. Shrang accepted these terms, and chose the Connacht region to settle his people. The sons of the goddess Danu would come to rule over the rest of the verdant island. Along with them, several new gods took root in Ireland. These deities created a new arm for King Nuada, which would become known as Nuada of the Silver Arm. The blood of these brave warriors fertilized the soil of the island of Ireland. Upon this rich land, a great culture flourished, and the heirs of this tradition would become known as Kelts. The Tuatha Dé Danann had invaded Irish lands and wanted to settle on the luscious Green Island. But to win the right to remain in this land, they had to fight the Firbolgs, a proud people and a worthy adversary for the children of the goddess Danu. The Tuatha Dé Danann were led by King Nuada, who led them to victory. But King Nuada paid a high price and lost his right arm in a battle. This heavy blow had severe consequences for the people of the goddess Danu. The Firbolgs surrendered, and a new Tuatha Dé Danann kingdom was founded in Ireland. But they needed to elect a new king. Nuada was the obvious choice. However, the tradition of the sons of Danu dictated that kings were perfect men. Nuada was missing an arm, making him ineligible for the throne. Another people of this land were the Fomorians, brute beings who lived in underwater hideouts and a threat to all who tried to inhabit Ireland. They were led by the mighty Balor, the terrible one-eyed Cyclops, who could destroy any enemy with powerful lightning bolts that streamed from his sight organ. The Tuatha Dé Danann did not want to fight such a powerful enemy immediately after their grueling war. Therefore, they proposed that Bress, a man of mixed race, son of the goddess Airi with Ilatha, a beautiful featured Fomorian prince. With this alliance between the peoples, peace reigned over Ireland. Everything indicated that choosing Bress as supreme king had been a good decision, but Bress's evil nature, inherited from the Fomorians, soon became obvious. Bress was a tyrannical and abusive king. Very high taxes were levied on gods and men. But the deity daughters of Danu suffered yet another huge humiliation. They were condemned to servitude, fulfilling tasks unworthy of divine beings. The mighty Dagda was forced to work the land with a hoe. The poet god Ogma was forced to carry lumber for the king. These two powerful gods were utterly humiliated before everyone, but they could not react. Bress was the legitimate king, chosen by the gods, and they had to submit to his will. But Ogma knew that Bress had a weak point. He hated poetry. Many people disliked it, and found the verses of the Celtic bards boring. But they could not show this annoyance to the poets, for it could arouse their wrath, leading them to craft horrific curses through their verses. The poet god Ogma sent his son Cairbre, who was also a great poet, to sing verses to Bress. Bress was greatly displeased to see a poet in his court. The king quickly interrupted the poet and told him to enjoy his castle's hospitality. Cairbre was taken to a room that looked more like a prison, where for dinner he was given porridge unworthy of the worst of criminals. The next day, Bress could not escape hearing the guest's poetry, composed especially for him. Bress, unable to endure the endless singing, and went wild, saying that the out-of-tune harp made his ears hurt, and that the sound of the bard's voice was more like the neighing of a donkey. The king had fallen into Ogma's trap, for he knew that his son would not accept such humiliation without responding. Cairbre strummed a frightening melody and sang verses that highlighted the defects of the tyrant king. Not only that, those harsh words hid a curse. Bress expelled the bard from court, but Cairbre had fulfilled his mission. Bress' beautiful face turned pale, and countless buds sprouted on his skin. The monarch's beauty was shattered by gigantic pustules. Like Nuada, Bress became an imperfect king, forced to abdicate the throne. But he did everything to hide his situation to continue to rule. But the Tuatha De Danann had to choose Bress' successor. Ogma and Dagda were ineligible, because they had been relegated to mere servants. But they had a great idea. The smithing goddess Brigit and the healing god Diane Kecht teamed up to create a new arm for Nuada. This new arm was made of silver, a work of art worthy of a king. The former king received his new arm, and from that day on, he became known as Nuada of the Silver Arm. The gods demanded Bress' resignation given his deformity, but he said he was the chosen king and would not abdicate the throne. Nuada warned him that if he did not, he would be forced to accept a duel between the two in a fight to the death to reveal the true successor in command of Ireland. But Bress balked and handed the throne to Nuada. Nuada was once more crowned king of the Tuatha De Danann, and justice again prevailed in those lands. But this peace was short-lived. Bress went to Balor, the powerful Fomorian leader, and told him how he had been betrayed by the sons of the goddess Danu. As the peace agreement between the Tuatha De Danann and the Fomorians was no longer valid, a new war was about to begin. After the fall of Bress, the tyrant king, Nuada's reign was re-established. After the return of the righteous and kind king, peace resurfaced in the Irish lands. Nuada brought prosperity, and happiness once again spread among the Tuatha De Danann. But Bress returned as a messenger from Balor, the Fomorians' powerful leader. The mouth of the deformed and deposed king uttered only spiteful and vengeful words. He brought with him the declaration of war, and so the peace between the Fomorians and the Tuatha De Danann came to an end. But the Fomorians knew that the Tuatha De Danann were worthy enemies. A brute force attack would not be enough to defeat them. Balor ordered the Fomorians to mobilize for war, but they would only leave when the entire army was armed and trained. Nuada knew that Balor was no fool, and that the war would be delayed. The Tuatha De Danann would also have time to organize for battle. Nuada led the men as king, but he needed a military chief to command the army. The mighty Dagda was the obvious choice, but there was a problem. The burly warrior and other noble fighters had been humiliated by Bress by being subjected to serfdom. This dishonor made them unworthy and ineligible for the position of army chief. But fate seemed intent on favoring the Tuatha De Danann. Gamea, a watchman at the Forest of the Sons of Danu, spotted a young warrior approaching. He was wearing clothes that identified him as a Tuatha De Danann, but the sentry did not know him. Gamea said that Nuada only allowed useful people to enter the court, and asked what talent distinguished the warrior. He said he was an excellent blacksmith and carpenter, but the watchman retorted, saying that Lugh was already a great carpenter, and there was no better blacksmith than Colum. The warrior said he was a great musician, expert on the harp, with the ability to sing finery like few others, as well as being expert in the magical arts. But Gamea retaliated again. Nuada's court had the best artists and druids. Adding another would only be yet another mouth to feed. The young man said that Nuada's court was packed with experts and men of enormous gallantry, but he doubted that there were any who had as many as he did. The watchman was intrigued and allowed him to have an audience with Nuada. Nuada was surprised to learn that there was a man in his court whose boldness led him to claim that he had countless such talents, and he wanted to know who such a person was. The warrior said his name was Lugh, son of Cian of the Tuatha De Danann and Ethniu, daughter of Balor of the Dreadful Eye. His parents had married to help seal the peace between the two peoples. At that moment, several spears were aimed at him. Danu's sons feared that he was a Fomorian spy, but Lugh tried to calm them down by telling them his story. Lugh was Balor's grandson, and when he was born, a druid prophesied that the young man would be responsible for Balor's death, putting an end to that terrorizing reign. Upon learning of the prophecy, Balor ordered the death of his grandchildren who were born that year. But Lugh's mother managed to hide the child and handed him over to be raised by a blacksmith to protect him from her fearsome father. Nuada recognized that fate might have sent the solution to his problems at his door. He therefore ordered the young man to show his fighting skills. Nuada and Lugh dueled, and the king realized that Lugh was one of the most proficient warriors he had ever fought. As a result, Nuada decided to appoint Lugh as the new war chief of the Tuatha De Danann. After some time had passed, the Fomorians established the camp that would serve as the base for the great battles to come. To learn more about his enemies, Dagda went to the camp as an emissary under the pretext of preventing war. Dagda was met by Balor, who restrained himself from killing the visitor with his terrible eye. After all, Bress had been punished for not fulfilling the duty of hospitality, and he did not wish to make the same mistake. But Balor had a plan: to offer the guest an excellent meal. Should he not eat it all, Dagda would offend his host, and for this, he could be punished by death. A huge dish was filled with a thick porridge, made from all kinds of food. It was an absurd quantity that no one could ever devour. At least so thought the Fomorians, but they underestimated that gluttonous warrior with a large waist. After loosening his belt, Dagda began his meal. As he ate, he counted every warrior and every weapon in the camp. The Fomorians watched Dagda in disbelief. He proceeded to consume all the food in the dish, and even ordered a drink to assist his digestion. Dagda sipped a huge barrel of beer in one gulp. That man's stomach seemed endless. The gods staggered visibly drunk and fell to the ground. The Fomorians debated whether to kill Dagda in his sleep, but they were still afraid of the great hero, even though he was passed out. To Dagda's surprise, a beautiful Fomorian named Ellen helped him up and told him she was in love with him. Dagda, even though he was a god, couldn't understand how a woman could fall in love with him after that gastronomical ordeal. But the sagacious god knew that it was pointless trying to understand the love drives of women. With her powers, Ellen helped Dagda escape from the Fomorian camp. Dagda felt extremely pleased as he reported to Nuada all that he had seen. Not because the Fomorians were gathering a powerful army, but because he had had the best meal of his life, while also getting a beautiful new lover. The great battle between the Tuatha De Danann and the monstrous Fomorians was about to begin. The tribe of the goddess Danu had divine items on their side. Goibniu was an extraordinary blacksmith, able to repair anything made of metal to perfection. Lugh was a superb carpenter, quickly repairing any broken shield and spear. But the healer Dian Kect was the decisive element, able to mend any wound or illness and even resurrect the dead, provided the victim had not lost his head. Morrigan united with the powerful Dagda, just as she had done with Nuada in the great battle against the Firbolgs. With this, the goddess granted the robust warrior even more strength and courage to face any enemy. Feeling strengthened by the goddess of death and war, Dagda claimed that he alone had managed to slaughter a third of the Firbolg enemies. Lugh, as war chief, discussed with the other warriors the last details before the conflict. They were aware of the danger posed by the enemies, but felt that fate would favor the sons of the goddess Danu. The two armies met on the plain where years ago they had fought against the Firbolgs for the right to live on the Green Island. The Fomorian army, led by Balor of the Terrible Eye, was very powerful. The warriors coming from the underwater caves uttered intimidating war cries. The second battle of Moitura was about to begin. The great battle started, and the two armies caused a huge bloodbath. The Tuatha De Danann fought with great bravery, while the Fomorians showed frightening verve. The warriors of the two factions battled it out. Many sons of Danu and Fomorians shed blood and dyed the green meadow with shades of red. Balor watched the carnage with pleasure, feeling that his warriors seemed to be defeating the god's offspring. Each fallen Fomorian took 2 enemy warriors with him. The first day of battle was over, and the outcome of the fighting was inconclusive. Many warriors of the Tuatha De Danann had perished. The next day promised to be even bloodier. On the second day of fighting, Dagda led the vanguard of the god's army. To Balor's disbelief, the contingent seemed undamaged even after he had seen many men die the day before. The weapons and shields were spotless, as if they had never been used. Balor was furious and ordered his army to attack at full strength, using all the warriors in reserve. It was another day of fierce fighting. As before, the Fomorians seemed to have slaughtered more enemies. But at night, the healer Dian Kect treated all the warriors' serious injuries and revived the fallen to fight again. The next day, Lugh led the troops, now superior in number, considering that virtually all the fighters had been rallied. Meanwhile, the Fomorians were fewer and fewer. On this day, the Tuatha De Danann seemed to have gotten the better of the Fomorians. The tide of war seemed to be tilting towards Danu's sons. But Bress, the deposed king of the Tuatha De Danann, told Balor how his enemies managed to reappear unharmed to fight the next day. Together, they hatched a plan to sabotage the enemy's actions. During the night, the Fomorians made a surprise attack against the miraculous fountain used by Dian Kect to raise the dead. The Fomorians clogged the spring with huge rocks, blocking the flow of the blessed water. Radan, son of Bress, sneaked into Goibniu's forge and stabbed the blacksmith god in the back. As Radan tried to escape from the forge, he heard Goibniu. Even though he had been brutally wounded, he shouted at him to stop in his tracks, for he had forgotten his knife. And so the blacksmith killed Bress's son. However, the Fomorian surprise attack overturned the Tuatha's great advantage. The next day, the Tuatha De Danann were again ready to fight. Even without being able to resurrect the fighters, King Nuada had more warriors than the Fomorians on the battlefield. Seizing this advantage would be decisive for the outcome of the war. The king therefore personally led the men on the front lines. Dagda fought like an angry bear, smashing the enemy's heads in with his powerful club. Nuada broke through the enemy lines, tearing the Fomorians apart with his divine sword. Balor was shocked at the scene. His troops were faltering in the face of an enemy they considered vastly inferior, and the gigantic Cyclops decided to act. Balor advanced against Nuada, and the fate of Ireland seemed about to be decided. Balor was tired of fighting fair and used all his power against the hero. Through his terrible eye, Balor launched a powerful lightning bolt at Nuada. who did nothing to defend himself in the face of that power. Lugh rushed to Nuada's aid, but the noble king of the Tuatha De Danann was dead. Balor, enraged, used all his power to decimate the Tuatha army. Lugh wanted to take revenge. He picked up a rock and called for Balor to face him. The monstrous Cyclops turned to him and charged his eye with enough energy to destroy any god. Lugh, using the humblest weapon, loaded the stone into the sling and waited for the right moment to deliver a perfect shot. He threw the stone with such force that, after piercing Balor's eye, it went through the back of his skull. Upon seeing their dead leader, the Fomorian army panicked and fled to the underwater caves. Bress was arrested and begged for mercy. He promised that he would pass on all his wisdom regarding agricultural knowledge. If they would spare him, the Irish cows would never deny them milk. Lugh was cheered by the people as the great hero of the Second Battle of Moytura and the exterminator of the terrible-eyed Cyclops Balor. With Nuada's death, Lugh became supreme chief of the Tuatha De Danann. Lugh guided his people to prosperity, and a bright reign began in Ireland. The Banshees were evil creatures from the fairy family. But, unlike their kindly relatives, Banshees lived in caves or in the darkest forest corners. Banshees usually avoided contact with humans, but did not forgive those who entered their domain. As a rule, Banshees looked like a morbid-looking woman, thin, tall, with pale skin, a tattered dress, and a dark look. But what terrified most about the Banshees was their extremely loud screams, which could be heard from kilometers away, bursting someone's eardrums or even skull. Due to their shadowy nature, Banshees were messengers of death. If a person saw a Banshee or heard her cry, even from a distance, they would die a few days later. Banshees could appear in both physical and spiritual form. Although their origin was uncertain, they would appear in the world when a young woman was the victim of a murder. Banshees' existence was thus marked by pain and suffering, causing them to weep and agonize constantly. As time passed, their eyes became red like fire. Another version of the Banshees' origin says that they were descendants of servants of Morrigan, the goddess of war and destruction in Celtic mythology. Banshees would appear during battles, and when a brave warrior was slaughtered, they would emit a long, sad cry. An old legend says that in 1437 a banshee appeared before King James I of Scotland and warned him that his death was near. Stories like this were common in ancient Celtic beliefs. Many women with the gift of premonition were nicknamed banshees. Banshees were so important in Celtic culture that a belief arose that they protected the members of the 5 noble families of Ireland, shedding only tears at the death of someone of nobility. With the advance of Christianity during the Middle Ages, the belief in banshees changed. They came to be seen as tormented souls who wandered through graveyards or the ruins of abandoned castles. In modern times, the legend of the Banshees is said to have had a simple and less macabre origin. The famous cries in the forests probably originated from a species of owl. The barn owl, known for letting out a long, high-pitched scream that elicited chills on dark nights. Whether these are folklore stories or not, we should avoid venturing into Irish forests at night. Otherwise, we may end up hearing the cry of death. On Ireland's dim roads, in the silence of the night, a supernatural being walks through the shadows, striking fear and dread into the hearts of those who cross his path. This is the Headless Horseman Dulahan, a legendary figure wrapped in mystery and terror. As legend has it, the Dulahan is a messenger of death, sent to collect the souls of the damned. Riding a black horse as ominous as himself, Dulahan rides at a frantic gallop, grasping his own severed head in one hand. His hideously pale head with an evil grin shines like the moon, illuminating the road ahead with a macabre glow. Dulahan's eyes are sharp and piercing, able to see over huge distances, always on the lookout for its victims. His mouth, perpetually twisted into a smile, is always whispering the name of the one whose soul he has come to seek. Everywhere he goes, doors close on their own, and the wind murmurs menacingly, announcing his arrival. They say a person is bound to die wherever Dulahan comes to a stop. He is known to spill human blood as part of his ritual, and anyone who sees him, even from a distance, is sentenced to perish soon. Once Dulahan has spoken their name, there is no escaping their fate. Like him, his horse is a hellish creature. With blazing eyes and nostrils oozing steam and fire, it gallops tirelessly, ignoring all obstacles in its path. There is no gate or barrier that can stop them, as they pass through all barriers as easily as the wind blows through leaves. Dulahan has a human spine like a whip, and its shattering sound is enough to paralyze anyone who hears it with fear. With one flick of his whip, he can open any door or lock any soul inside. Anyone who dares to eavesdrop or challenge his presence can be struck down by his wrath. Only one barrier stands against the Dulahan: gold. For unknown reasons, he fears this precious metal and flinches at the sight of it. Small coins or even jewels may be enough to ward off the Headless Horseman and protect one's soul from perdition. When night falls and darkness overtakes the world, you'd better stay off the lonely roads and pray that you never catch the sound of horses' hooves approaching in the deadly silence. For if you do, you may find Dulahan creepily smiling as your soul is swept away to the afterlife. The Fomorians are one of the most enigmatic peoples of Celtic mythology. They were sea giants, who represented the forces of darkness and chaos. Their power was feared by the Celtic peoples who inhabited the Irish coasts. The origin of the Fomorians is uncertain. However, they are believed to be one of the oldest races in Celtic mythology, preceding the renowned Tuatha De Danann, the Celtic gods of light. They lived in caves and underwater grottos, posing a constant danger to adventurers at sea. Despite their malevolent nature, the Fomorians could perform incredible feats. According to legends, they had magical abilities that allowed them to transform into sea animals, controlling natural forces. The Fomorians were also known for working with metals. Many of the oldest Celtic artifacts are attributed to them. The Fomorians were led by Balor, the giant with one eye in the middle of his forehead, who could hurl a deadly bolt of lightning, capable of destroying an entire army. Balor was considered an evil force, feared by the Celtic peoples. He was believed to cause destruction and death. The most famous stories about the Fomorians are the epic battles against the Celtic gods of light. One of these surrounds the clash between Balor and Lugh, one of the Celtic gods of light. Lugh was known for his skill with the spear and faced Balor in a unique combat. He used his magic spear to pierce Balor's eye. Other versions say he used a sling and a stone, killing him instantly. This victory was one of the most important moments in the history of Celtic mythology, as it signaled the triumph of light over darkness. The battle between the Fomorians and the Tuatha De Danann was one of the most important in Celtic mythology. The Celtic gods of light managed to expel and exile the Fomorians to their underwater caves, where they were condemned to live forever. Despite their defeat, the Fomorians were considered a frightening force by the Celtic peoples inhabiting the Irish coasts. They were depicted in many stories and legends as evil beings who inhabited the sea and attacked ships passing through its waters. The Fomorians were also associated with many sea creatures. In some legends, they were able to transform themselves into sea animals to chase and capture anyone who challenged their will. The history of the Fomorians has been studied and is subject to speculation. Some researchers believe that the mythology of the Fomorians was created to represent the threats that the Celtic people faced on the Irish coasts, such as storms, giant waves, and other natural forces. Others think that the Fomorians were created to represent the threats of the warrior tribes that inhabited the lands surrounding Ireland. These tribes were known for their ability to raid and plunder coastal villages, and may have inspired the creation of the Fomorians. The legends of the Fomorians shaped Celtic culture and influenced many aspects of the island's people. The stories have inspired works of art, music, and literature. Their influence is in many Celtic traditions today. Spriggans, whilst also part of the fairy family, bear few traits in common with their relatives, and are perhaps the oddest creatures in British mythology. Spriggans are usually male beings with a distorted and hideous body, often made of wood and tree leaves. Although they are almost always small, Spriggans were regarded as the ghosts of giants, who, despite inhabiting a more fragile body, maintained their former enormous strength. Some tales describe them as being able to grow to an extraordinary size when they are irritated, restoring for a short period of time all the power of their past as giants. Spriggans dwell in old castle ruins, where they guard buried treasures and are fond of wreaking evil on those who offend them. They are blamed for bringing bad luck, allowing a house to be robbed or a building to collapse, or cattle to be stolen.
In a period when the people of Ireland were plagued by terrifying legends that haunted their thoughts, the historical records mention a nobleman named Oberto, who was renowned for his tyrannical rule. Despite his tiny stature, he had an intimidating presence that instilled fear in others, largely attributable to his reputation for cruelty and tyranny. However, on a certain day, tired of enduring the oppressive rule of Oberto, the inhabitants of the village, under the guidance of a valiant chieftain named Cathan, initiated a rebellion against the despotic leader. In a highly intense battle, Cathan successfully overcame Oberto, proving he was a resilient and determined warrior, despite his relatively small stature. In line with the customs of the era, the malevolent nobleman buried him in an upright position. Much to the astonishment and dread of all, Oberto resurfaced the following day, displaying even greater cruelty and strength as he sought vengeance upon those who had betrayed him. Cathan confronted him once more and emerged victorious, subsequently burying him again. However, on this occasion, they mutilated the nobleman's corpse. Nevertheless, the evil monarch re-emerged, perpetuating the relentless cycle of demise and rebirth, consequently inflicting a curse upon the populace. Overwhelmed by despair, Cathan turned to a druid for assistance. After recounting the tale, the latter presented a chilling revelation. Oberto had transcended his humanity and become an undead entity, a malicious being that derived power from consuming the blood of his subjects. Cathan received guidance from the hermit regarding the necessary measures to terminate Oberto's tyrannical rule. Specifically, he was advised to use a sword crafted from yew wood, a plant symbolizing both life and death. Following Oberto's demise, it was crucial to bury him in an inverted position, along with the placement of a substantial stone atop the grave, preventing his reemergence. Armed with this information, Cathan confronted Oberto for their final encounter. The battle was marked by its brutality, culminating in Cathan's ultimate triumph over the tyrant. Using a sword crafted from yew, Cathan skillfully pierced the heart of the cursed creature, thereby securing victory. Oberto's body was subsequently buried in an inverted position, with a huge stone on top of him. The inhabitants of the village experienced a sense of relief. Oberto's curse had finally been lifted. According to widespread belief, the grave of the Irish vampire remains open to this day, situated beneath a tree near the town of Slaughtaverney. However, there are individuals who still believe that the curse of Oberto is unbroken. According to this perspective, when an individual vanishes under mysterious circumstances, it is possible that they have fallen victim to the Irish vampire.
A well-known figure from Scottish Celtic folklore, the cat Sith is a large black cat about the size of a panther that used to stand upright. The cat was rumored to be a witch disguised in feline form. She could transform herself into the cat Sith up to 8 times. If she turned into a cat for the 9th time, the witch would be trapped in the feline form forever. According to legend, these mischievous cats would sneak into cemeteries to steal the souls of the dead before they departed for the afterlife. The black cats were therefore driven away by the relatives of the dead, who tried to protect the souls of their family members. During the Samhain festivals, or during our Halloween, tales suggest that it is best to leave a bowl of milk in front of the door of one's house for the Catseath, so that it brings luck to the residents and the house is free from the Catseath's retaliation. Selkies are fantastic mythological creatures from northern Scottish, Irish, and Icelandic folklore. They are the seal women and are supposed to be a different kind of mermaid. Selkies are sinful human beings who were punished and obliged to live like seals until the end of time, according to some Christian legends from that region. But other sources seem to suggest that they are innocent, pure, and sweet creatures. In the water, a Selkie cannot be discerned from an ordinary seal. But once on dry land, the creature can shed its seal skin and adopt the form of a beautiful young human. One of the most well-known legends about these creatures is called the Selkie Bride. It recounts that, on a night when the moon was full, a fisherman saw 3 beautiful young women dancing on the rocks where seals often rested. The fisherman had previously heard of the Selkies, but had never seen one in person, so he moved closer to take a closer look. However, he was spotted by the female seals, who are always on the lookout for potential predators. The fisherman came across a seal skin, which certainly would belong to a Selkie that was supposed to still be around. He found a beautiful and frightened young woman cowering among the rocks and told her that no harm would come to her. The young girl implored the fisherman to give her back her skin, as without it, the Selkie could not return to the sea. But the fisherman was in love, telling her that from that day forward, he would take care of her in his house, and the Selkie would become his wife. He took the young girl to his home, and from that day on, they became a couple. He hid her sealskin to prevent the Selkies from fleeing. Years passed, and the fisherman and the Selkie had several children. However, although the Selkie was loved and treated well, she was not entirely happy, as that was not the place where she truly belonged. The youngest son one day saw his mother crying as she contemplated the sea, and asked her the reason for those tears. She replied that she loved all her children, and had tender feelings for her husband, but that she missed her real home. Then the boy realized that his mother was a Selkie, a magical creature he had heard so much about from adults. When his father and brothers were not home one day, the boy searched the house for his mother's sealskin. He stumbled upon the skin inside the chimney and gave it back to his mother. She cried when she found her skin again. She kissed her son and thanked him for the skin, saying that she would never forget him and would always love him. The fisherman could still see his wife rushing towards the sea, holding the seal skin. The young woman leaped into the water and was never seen again. During all the ensuing years, however, the fisherman and his children found plenty to eat, as a flock of seals helped them by herding huge shoals of fish into their nets. It is told that the Selkie never stopped watching over their human children until the end of their days.
Balor is one of the most evil and feared beings in Ireland's folklore. His origin is largely shrouded in mystery. There are different legends about how he came into the world, but all agree that his parents, Boraineach and Dot, were not exactly an ordinary couple. According to some, Balor was conceived by chthonic forces, ancestral entities that roam the bowels of the earth, which would explain his monstrous nature. There are other versions pointing to the influence of marine beings, perhaps dark gods of the oceans, which relates to his dwelling on the Tory Island, battered by the Atlantic waves. But Balor's evil eye is what truly makes him terrifying. Can you imagine a power so overwhelming that a single glance can kill or destroy instantly? The eye was a lethal weapon, a reflection of the chaotic force that throbbed within him. Balor was not a lone monster. He was the king of the Fomorians, a demonic and chaotic race of beings who personified the worst of everything.
war, disease, famine, winter. The Fomorians were the very opposite of the Tuatha De Danann, the gods who brought order and civilization to Ireland. Under Balor's leadership, the Fomorians stood for the constant threat of chaos, always ready to destroy everything the Tuatha De Danann had built. The shadow that loomed over the light, the brute force that defied reason. Balor's life was not only blood feasts and plundering. A dark shadow hung over his destiny, the prophecy of death. A cruel one which dictated that Balor would meet his end at the hands of his own grandson. The prophecy was like a poison that spread through Balor's soul, eating away at his peace and shaping his actions. He became fixated on defying fate. His dread turned into paranoia, choosing his daughter Ethnui, a young woman of unrivaled beauty, as the key to avoiding the prophecy. To keep her from giving birth to the grandson who would bring about his ruin, Balor imprisoned Ethnui in a crystal tower on the Tory Island, cut off from the world and the company of anyone. The tower represented Balor's oppressive control, his desperate attempt to manipulate the future. By imprisoning Ethnui, he believed he could freeze time and prevent the inevitable. When the Crystal Tower was built as a challenge to fate, it became the stage for Destiny's own rebellion. The prophecy that Balor had feared so much found an unexpected way to be fulfilled. As Ethnui grieved in her lonely prison, a god of the Tuatha De Danann by the name of Cian found her. Entranced by her beauty, using magic, Cian succeeded in circumventing Balor's vigilance and joining Ethnui. Lugh was born from this secret union, a radiantly beautiful boy with extraordinary intelligence. He inherited the strength of the Tuatha De Danann, and unknowingly, carried with him the fate of his grandfather Balor. Brought up in hiding, far from the Tory Island and Balor's wrath, Lugh grew up learning the arts of war, poetry, and magic. He grew up to be a master of all disciplines, a fully fledged hero, ready to challenge any obstacle. Eventually, the news of his birth reached Balor's ears. Now the prophecy he had tried to avoid for so long come true. The Fomorian king felt terror, but also intense rage. He swore to destroy Lugh and anyone who opposed him. This was the final battle between the Tuatha De Danann and the Fomorians, the fight of order against chaos. Spearheaded by Balor, the Fomorians rushed forward like a dark, grotesque, and bestial wave, oozing the fierceness of indomitable nature. Their monstrous appearance was a reflection of the threat they posed to the hard-won order of the Tuatha De Danann. Meanwhile, across from them, the Tuatha De Danann were geared up to defend the civilization they had built. These were skilled warriors and powerful mages, but the looming shadow of fear hung over them, knowing how destructive the eye of Balor was. Death lurked in their gaze. Standing out in the heart of this raging maelstrom was the gleaming hero Lugh. He was the hope of the Tuatha De Danann, the personification of intelligence and courage. He knew that everyone's fate rested on his ability to stand up to Balor and overcome his evil eye. The battle unfolded in a swirl of steel, magic, and war cries. Heroes faced each other in deadly showdowns, while spells streaked across the sky like lightning. The battlefield was a chaotic scene of blood, fire, and torn bodies. The merciless Balor let loose the fury of his eye, cutting down lives with a single glance. The Tuatha De Danann fought bravely, but their ranks dwindled at every turn, devoured by the power of the Fomorian king. Balor stood up to Nuada, the king of the Tuatha De Danann. Although a tremendous warrior, he was unable to stand against the power of Balor's terrible eye. During this critical moment, Lugh seized the lead and challenged Balor to a final duel. The intensity was tangible, the air crackling with the energy of both opponents. The fate of the world rested on this confrontation. Standing proud in his fury, Balor held up the heavy eyelid of the evil eye. A terrible wave of energy built up, ready to be unleashed. This was death in flesh, the power to annihilate entire armies with a single glance. However, in a lightning-fast movement, Lugh hurled the stone from his sling, which hit Balor square in the eye, smashing through it with a hideous crash. The giant roared in pain before stumbling and collapsing. The Fomorian king was now dead. The prophecy had been fulfilled. the predestined grandson Lugh had won, rescuing the Tuatha De Danann and ensuring the victory of order over chaos. The Cath mage Tuireadh became a hallmark of Celtic mythology, a symbol of the eternal struggle between light and darkness, civilization and barbarism. Balor's story, the Cyclops King, brings to mind the fragility of power, the inescapability of fate, and the courage needed to face our fears, especially when they take the form of an eye capable of shattering the world. Balor goes beyond the confines of Celtic mythology and taps into an ancestral fear present in many cultures. His deformed, monstrous figure, with destructive power concentrated in a single eye, establishes him as an evil archetype. He epitomizes nature's brute force, the primordial chaos that endangers order and civilization. This depiction is echoed in other mythologies. The Cyclops Polyphemus from Homer's Odyssey shares similarities with Balor. Both are single-eyed giants, isolated on islands and standing for brutal violence and savagery. Odysseus's cleverness in blinding Polyphemus is matched by Lugh's cleverness, as he uses his sling to defeat Balor's evil eye. But the evil eye figure goes beyond Greco-Roman and Celtic mythology. In many cultures, the belief in an eye capable of bringing harm, illness, or misfortune is persistent. Amulets and talismans are worn for protection, and rituals are performed to ward off the evil eye. Present in different times and places, this belief unveils a deep-rooted fear in the human psyche, the fear of envy, greed, and the destructive power that emanates from ill-intentioned glances. The evil eye is an invisible threat, a danger that lurks beneath the surface, poised to strike at any moment. With his eye capable of petrifying or killing, Balor brutally personifies this fear. He is the monster who watches us from the shadows, the malevolent force bent on destroying everything good that exists. His tale reminds us of life's fragility, the need to protect ourselves from the evil forces, and the importance of intelligence and courage to overcome the darkness. Despite its terrifying nature, Balor encourages us to reflect on our own fears, on the shadows that dwell in our souls, and on the strength that lies within us to face them.
Fairies are commonly portrayed as gentle and joyful beings that fly and flutter between flowers and trees. But there are also malevolent fairies who go to great lengths to harm humans. Leanan Sidhe, also known as the fairy lover in Irish folklore, is a prime example of an evil entity. Leanan is often depicted as an exquisitely beautiful woman who tends to favor talented musicians, poets, and writers as her companions. These would succumb to the fairy's seductive charms and become her lovers. Under her influence, artists can craft works of incredible beauty and intense emotion that surpass what they would be capable of on their own. However, this inspiration comes with a cost. Individuals who encounter Leanan Sidhe frequently experience brief lives, characterized by intense passion, yet ultimately culminating in sorrowful downfalls. The idea of the tormented artist whose exceptional talent is achieved through significant personal struggles is a recurring theme in both literature and art. These artists experience immense success, but eventually lose their muse, causing them to spiral into a deep depression that can lead to madness and ultimately death. Leanan Sidhe is a creature that is believed to be vampiric in nature. It is said to drain the vital energy from its victims and then take their spirits into another dimension after using them. This Celtic fairy is a perilous symbol of a predominant theme in literature and art. This revolves around the idea of an anguished artist who possesses exceptional talent but must endure significant personal hardships as a result.
Off the rugged, windswept coast of Scotland's Orkney Islands, a terrible tale lingers, whispered across the generations on stormy nights. This is the legend of the Nucalavi, a demon so hideous that its sheer utterance makes the blood run cold. Born from the dark, salty waters, this being is a nightmare incarnate, an abomination that roams between sea and land. The Nucalavi is horrifyingly portrayed. Just imagine a horse whose skin has been ripped off, revealing its pulsating red flesh and darkened veins. The grotesque figure of a man emerges from its back, fused together in a monstrous way with the horse's body. This rider and its mount are a single entity, a nightmarish hybrid. The man's head is unnaturally large. His eyes are like smoldering coals, glaring and hatred-filled. From his ever-open mouth gushes a poisonous breath, able to wither crops and spread disease to the living. The knuckle of his arms are elongated and inhuman, with claw-like outstretched fingers, ready to grab any hapless being that passes by. The horse's legs show unnaturally large muscles, allowing it to run with frightening speed on land and in the water. The knuckle of his rage targets all living things. It hates life, happiness, and any sign of joy. It emerges from the sea during the winter months, bringing with it pestilence and destruction. The coastal villages are all too aware of Knuckle of His wrath. Crop fields shrivel and die, livestock is found lifeless, and river water is poisoned once this harmful creature has passed through. There are not many safeguards against the Knuckle of He. The stories speak of only one weakness, the fear of fresh water. When it emerges from the salty sea, people pray for rain, hoping that the rivers and streams will flow strongly, forming barriers that it cannot dare to cross. But even this is a flimsy protection, and many have perished by relying on this shred of hope. The stories speak of the few survivors who have crossed the Knuckle of He and lived to tell the tale. They describe unparalleled terror, the stench of decomposition, and the unnerving sight of living flesh and burning eyes. Their hooves were said to sound like thunder, and their war cry echoed from the abyss, a warning of coming destruction. When nights are long and dark on the Orkney Islands, as the sea winds are howling in agony, people remember the legend of the Knuckle of He. They shun the beaches and pray for freshwater protection, waiting for the sea demon to linger in the depths, far from their homes and lives. If it does rise, there will be nowhere to hide from the Knuckle of He's raging fury.
Leprechauns are Ireland's best-known mythical figures. They have become cultural symbols and are often associated with folklore, magic, and of course, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. The look of leprechauns has evolved over the centuries to what we know today, with green clothing, wide-brimmed hats, buckled shoes, and red beards. The leprechaun's origin dates back to Celtic mythology and Irish legends. They are believed to be the descendants of the Tuireadh de Danann, an ancient and supernatural race of Irish gods and heroes. Before the growth of Christian influence in Ireland, leprechauns were viewed differently from what we know today. They were known as Locrepan, small fairy and elf-like creatures. But after the expansion of Christianity in Ireland, these creatures were changed and became the leprechauns of today. Leprechauns are known as mischievous and cunning creatures. They are solitary and spend much of their time making shoes and protecting treasures. In medieval Ireland, the art of shoemaking was symbolically associated with prosperity and luck, as a good shoe was essential for a successful journey. Finding a leprechaun could be a sign of good luck, as he could fulfill wishes or reveal where the valuable pot of gold is. But after finding it, one should not lose sight of it at any time, otherwise it will disappear, and the person will be left with nothing. One of Ireland's best-known legends about leprechauns is that the pot of gold is at the end of the rainbow. The spellbinding legend has fed the imagination of generations and epitomizes the quest for wealth and happiness. Leprechauns have become cultural icons and a major symbol of Irish folklore, appearing in movies, books, games, and TV shows. They are also associated with St. Patrick's Day, an Irish festival celebrated annually on March the 17th in honor of Ireland's patron saint. But in most festivities, the leprechauns are the center of attention.